on this evening. Nabila Ramdani is a French-Algerian journalist. She specialises in French politics and in the Middle East. Since you were last in here with me, Nabila, you've been on the phone talking to people, a lot of reporters and officials in France. What are they telling you?
Yes, indeed, and we still have an awful lot to learn about what is effectively an unfolding story, and it is very sinister and indeed macabre. I've spoken to government sources and indeed to the City Hall in Paris, who have confirmed that 140 people have been killed in Paris tonight, including children, and especially in the theatre where hostages were held. 100, it seems, have been executed one by one before a grenade exploded in the theatre. Police forces then went in, and apparently the French president is going to be on the scene as well shortly. The scenes in Paris tonight are ones of, a city and indeed a country under siege, and that's also reflected in the measures that have been taken by the government, and especially by closing off the borders effectively. There are curfews, there's a curfew implemented, and indeed a state of emergency, which didn't happen in the country since 2005 when there were riots
and
on
even
housing
then,
estates.
some commentators have been saying even then it wasn't a countrywide state of emergency, so this takes it even further than 10 years ago.
Well, absolutely. At the time, it was definitely targeted at stopping young, angry people from going on rampage and destroying public property as they vented their anger against the government. But this is, we're talking about an absolutely, terrorist attack on a massive scale. To give you an element of comparison, the last time there was a terrorist attack that was, perceived as massive in France was in 1961, when 26 people were killed on the train by the OAS, which was an organisation fighting the government for Algeria to remain under French control. But what happened tonight, we're well off the measure of the 1961 attacks.
I'm just reading from Reuters, Nabila, that Belgium is now imposing new checks on its border with France, particularly looking at rail and air arrivals after these attacks. We know that the borders are closing, but at the same time we were hearing that France was still going to allow trains to run and flights to take off and land. I mean, whether they are just journeys that people will undertake within the country has not been made clear, but a massive impact on people if the borders are closed. Well,
yes, indeed, and I think it does reflect the atmosphere of confusion in France at the moment. Of course, it's very unclear as well what the government is trying to say by closing its borders. Is it trying to prevent people from leaving the country, but possibly the people behind the attacks? Is it trying to prevent people from getting in the country to perpetrate further attacks? But what is certain tonight is that the movement of people will be monitored, and the French president has now to appear as to show some leadership and to try to reassure people, which is a very challenging task for him to do, and that involves, of course, means of transports which are extremely hard to monitor.
A very difficult balance, isn't it, for decision makers to strike? They need to keep people safe. They need to have visible signs, 1,500 extra troops on the streets, and supposedly not just in Paris but in France. But you don't want normal life to grind to a halt.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have to give the impression that people can carry on with their lives as normal as possible. But under these circumstances, it's very clear that the French government will have questions to answer as far as, what are seen as massive security failures. It's impossible to convince people that they can, start leading a normal life again, especially as soon, so shortly after what were major terrorist attacks back in January against the Charlie Hebdo offices and indeed a kosher supermarket in central Paris.
The other issue, I suppose, as well, is if it turns out that any of these attackers, and we don't know how many we're dealing with in these multiple sites, if any of them were on a watch list, if any of them had been known, because of course it's not inconceivable, is it, for these people to be acting alone, a small group of people who maybe in their minds allied to another group somewhere else, but not necessarily known to the authorities.
Well, you're quite right to raise this very important point, because as what happened with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the terrorists involved were in fact known to the authorities, and as often people who do perpetrate these kind of attacks are known to the authorities. But it has to be said that in France they are often on a watch list, but they often let off and they slip off. You know, the authorities give up on keeping an eye on them, as it were. And that will absolutely be held against President Hollande, who has tried to firm up security measures after the Charlie Hebdo attack, dare I say, by trying to step up security measures through monitoring the internet, monitoring the expression of extremism online, but also by passing surveillance law, much stricter surveillance laws, in spite of oppositions from human rights organizations, for example. And clearly this hasn't been enough in terms of intelligence.
A great deal of statements and condolences coming in from leaders around the world, and now here's Angela Merkel's statement, the German Chancellor, of course. "I am deeply shaken by the news and pictures that are reaching us from Paris," she said. We also heard earlier from President Obama and David Cameron expressing similar sentiments. Angela Merkel goes on to say, "My thoughts in these hours are with the victims of what appears to be a terrorist attack." And just another note, I've just spotted via AFP that the Turkish president, who was voted back into office with a majority only last weekend, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, offered his condolences as well following these attacks tonight, calling for a consensus of the international community against terrorism. He went on to say, "As a country that knows very well the manner and consequences of terrorism, we understand perfectly the suffering that France is experiencing now." How well does France cooperate with other countries when it comes to sharing intelligence? Because that too will no doubt come under the spotlight.
Yes, indeed, and especially, you know, after tonight, many countries around the world, and especially Western countries, would be extremely worried about similar attacks happening on their soil as well, especially so as many of them are involved, or indeed willing to be involved more, as it were, in war zones like Syria or indeed Iraq. In fact, there have been reports about shouts being heard in central Paris for Syria, which might suggest that these attacks might have happened as if you like, as an opposition to France's involvement in Syria. It has started to bomb ISIS targets very recently. So all the likelihood is that it might be linked to ISIS-affiliated groups.
As you say, it's early days and we've got to wait to get identification of these attackers, but certainly what you say is being reflected on social media, that certain websites that are allied to militants are celebrating what they've seen happen in Paris tonight. Nabila Ramdani, we appreciate you giving us your perspective. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.